Well, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this webinar from the Australasian Dark Sky Alliance. This is the fourth in our webinar series this year, and we try to have these things on a regular basis. So hopefully this is not your first. If it is, very welcome. Look out for more to come. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm speaking from today. I'm based in the northern western suburbs of Sydney in Australia, on the lands of the Wadamatago people of the Darug Nation, whose ancestors have looked after this land since the Dreamtime. And I think that's a very fitting acknowledgement for this talk in particular, which is going to be exploring the ancient connection of humanity with the night sky, a very compelling topic, and I'm sure we're in for a fantastic talk. For those of you who are not entirely sure what the Australasian Dark Sky Alliance is, we are a registered charity who advocates for the protection and appreciation of the night environment, whether it be astronomy or the nocturnal environment for animals, and the night environment in all its shapes and forms. And so you've probably come to this from investigating our website or catching one of our emails. Very welcome to those of you who have just joined us for the first time. You can check out our website. It looks a bit like my background, and there's ways to join and find out what we do, donate for us, and so on. And we'll maybe touch on that again at the end of the talk. Okay, it is my great pleasure to welcome our speaker for this webinar, Professor Clive Ruggles. Clive is Emeritus Professor in Archaeoastronomy at the University of Leicester, and is actually joining us from an Iron Age shed. I don't think the shed is from the Iron Age, but it's located in a village that's from the Iron Age in the Welsh countryside, because Clive is actually in the middle of doing fieldwork in the topic that he's going to talk to us about tonight. So we are very appreciative for Clive fitting us into his hectic schedule. Clive is very respected in this field of archaeoastronomy. He's published many books and papers on the subject. I encourage you to explore his website, some fantastic images, a great collection of material there, some of which I'm sure he'll share with us tonight. And so with that, I would like to, I should also mention that joining us is also Marnie Og, my fellow member of the Australasian Dark Sky Alliance, and Fred Watson there, who some of you may know, Australia's astronomer at large, will be joining us in the question session at the end of the talk. I should say that you should feel free to use the Q&A button on the Zoom session to post your questions at any stage in the talk, and then we'll review those at the end, and hopefully Clive will get a chance to address your interesting questions after we hear his talk. Okay, so Clive, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Richard, and good morning, everyone, because it's morning here. And you see me in my splendid shed that Richard mentioned. I'm going to attempt to share a screen with you, so you've got other things to look at here, and hopefully you will see my opening screen there. I'm looking for a nod from Richard. Perfect. Okay. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. Well, I ask a question here. I'm actually not going to spend most of this talk answering the question. I'm going to build up to my answer to this question, which will be right at the end. And I'm coming at it from two different aspects. One is the archaeoastronomy that Richard mentioned, which is what I do, and I'll explain all about that. And the other is heritage, and particularly world heritage, which is something else that I've got involved in doing over the last 10 years. And together they will funnel into my ultimate answer to this question, which if you wait long enough, you'll get at the end. So as Richard mentioned, that's Richard, right, there we go. So I'm actually giving you this talk from one of the best dark sky areas in England and Wales, as it happened, and dark skies for us are generally pretty rubbish, as you can see from the map. But we do have some nice areas and indeed some little dark sky parks. But this is where I am at this moment, and it's beautiful. And I actually only arrived last night, but we did have a good night, so I did get out there and enjoy it for a bit. But normally I'm actually, where am I located? In one of these little tiny, ever so dark, slightly dark blue areas in the middle of this mess over here. So I'm based in Leicestershire, and I'll explain to you what I'm actually doing in Pembrokeshire at the end, or if I forget, someone please remind me, and I'll talk to you about that then. But it's not but because of the dark skies that I'm here. So what I do is archaeoastronomy, as mentioned, and you may have some images in your mind about what archaeoastronomy is all about. And if you think, well, it's got to do with combining archaeology and astronomy and thinking about how ancient people looked at the skies and things, and it has to do with things like pyramids and Stonehenge and the Nebra disk, if you've heard of it, and stuff like that, well, you'd be broadly right. I'll give you my favorite. Oh, and I should say that a lot of us now prefer to call it cultural astronomy, because if you have archaeoastronomy, then you also have ethnoastronomy, which is how modern indigenous peoples understand the sky. And there's no real boundary between the two. So a lot of us prefer to talk about cultural astronomy now is what we're interested in. But here's my little definition of it, just for your edification. And the important thing about this is we're not just interested in beliefs and practices about the sky in the past, but also what uses people put that to. So in a sense, archaeoastronomy for me is nothing if it's not part of broader archaeology. It's about understanding people and cultures in the past and how their knowledge of the sky and their understanding of the sky fed into that. So there you go, there's the definition. And I just wanted to start by getting rid of a few popular misconceptions about archaeoastronomy. So here's the Giza pyramids in Egypt. And some of you may have a broad feeling in your mind that there's something to do with the layout of monuments on the ground, reflecting constellations in the sky. And here's something from Giza. Here's the 3 Giza pyramids, and you'll see that they seem to be laid out by like the belt of Orion. Here's the stars, here's some pyramids. And in fact, there have been 1 or 2 popular books about this, and this is why the idea is widely known. Basically, if you're prepared to select stars that fit a model and miss out a few that don't, and if you're prepared to equally to select monuments that fit a model and miss out a few that don't, and then maybe fiddle a bit in the corners and stretch things a bit, you can fit anything to anything. So this is a nonsense, basically, and it's not what people in the past were doing. And even if they were interested in mapping what they saw in the skies, they wouldn't have done this in that way. And we know examples. They wouldn't do it by precisely placing either monuments or even the way they draw things on pieces of paper. This is not what it's about. And of course, the other thing you might think of is Stonehenge. And yes, I will talk a little bit about Stonehenge, but and if you have the idea that Stonehenge is some sort of ancient observatory, certainly people come and look at the solstice, the midsummer sunrise at Stonehenge. They've been doing it for 150 years. And here you see some modern druids. And a former colleague of mine, archaeologist Aubrey Burl, once came out with the famous statement that modern druids have as much to do with ancient druids as ancient druids had to do with Stonehenge, which is nothing in both cases. I mean, Druids were much later than Stonehenge, and the modern Druids is a modern thing. Nothing against what they're getting out of being at Stonehenge at the solstice. But what that doesn't mean is that Stonehenge was any sort of ancient observatory, as again in popular books this has been claimed. Stonehenge Decoded was the book that did it in the early 60s. The idea that there were literally dozens of sun and moon alignments at Stonehenge. I'm getting a message saying my internet connection is unstable. I hope you can still hear me okay, but I will rely on Richard and Marnie to wave at me frantically if something goes wrong. But again, this is all about selecting things, and there are lots of things in the sky. There are lots of points on the horizon where they rise and set. And if you're prepared to select a few alignments between things, and some of them may be not quite the same period archaeologically, again, you can fit anything to anything. Stonehenge was not an ancient observatory, but it did have its solstitial alignment, and I'll mention that right at the end. So again, this is not what it's about. And the last thing is this whole idea of ancient observatories. This is very popular up on the internet. And here are some examples that you can see on the internet. This is actually a Korean sun watching tower. It did have to do with astronomy. We know this from records, but people stood on this to make observations of the star. It wasn't an observatory in a modern sense at all, but people did watch the skies from this place, amongst other places. An example from the Mayan world that's often cited. Well, this looks like an observatory, for goodness sake. Round buildings were very, very rare in the Mayan world. This is the only well-preserved one. We think there were 2 or 3 others. Most of them are rectangular and so on. But that doesn't in itself mean it was an observatory, and there's no evidence that it was. People have found alignments from various windows, various star rises. But again, to actually, and it's highly disputed amongst specialists as to whether it did have astronomical purposes or not. Newgrange is a tomb. It's a Neolithic tomb in Ireland. I'll just come back to that in just a moment. Here's a site in Germany that is often claimed as one of the oldest ancient observatories, almost 6,000 years old and more. And it was some sort of very early Neolithic meeting place that we think was enclosed in this wooden palisades. People came here perhaps for training, perhaps for ceremonies. It had 3 entrances, and they broadly align. One is north-south and the other couple in the solstitial direction. Maybe that meant something to people, but this was not a place where people came to exclusively look at the skies. And that's the problem with this word observatory, that you think modern observatory, our ancient observatory, it's somewhere where people came exclusively or mainly to do observations of the skies. And when people were making observations in the skies in the past, it was usually in a much broader a context of life in general. Let's just going back to Newgrange here. So this is a very famous, big, huge, in fact, Neolithic tomb. It's 60 meters across. A 20-meter long passage goes into the center of the tomb. Here you see the plan of it. And these were where bones of the dead were buried inside. And famously, on a few days around the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, when the sun rises, it rises and shines through an actual lintel in a box above the entrance and shines down this whole passage, and would have done in the past. The shift in where the sun is coming up the solstice now to then, which is about a solar diameter, doesn't make a huge difference to this, though it has altered it slightly. But the point is that this was a dark space inside this tomb, and it was dark for 11.5 months of the year. And then just these few moments after sunrise, around the shortest day, the sun shone right in. And this roof box appears to have been deliberately constructed because at some stage the entrance was blocked off and no one went inside. This wasn't an observatory. It may have been aligned upon the winter sunrise, but it wasn't an observatory, it was a tomb. Even when it was first built, people didn't go inside to say, well, I wonder if it's the shortest day yet. I'll wander down inside the door. It's a bit smelly in here, all these bones, but I'm going to sit down and see whether the sun rises. Of course they didn't. It was a tomb. And so if we ask ourselves, why did they orient it? The answer is going to be something about connections that existed in people's minds between death and ancestors and ancestor spirits on the one hand, and on the other hand, between the sun and seasons and seasonality. And what it's telling us is that probably in people's minds, the spirits of the ancestors were helping to turn the sun around, to make sure that seasonal renewal would happen in the next season. This is how in people's minds today, this is how they made sense of the world around them and how the world worked. And they're making that connection between ancestors and the seasonal renewal. And that is why they symbolize that connection, why it's important to make that sort of orientation in the tomb. So it's that sort of thing. We're looking at astronomy, how people connected to the skies, but trying to understand something of the context in which they're doing it, which is very different from ours. As tombs, people also oriented houses to sunrise, and this is an example that I think tells us a lot. This is traditional houses from the Navajo in North America. And this is actually a picture from the Pawnee, but it's a similar idea. So traditionally, the traditional houses of the Navajo, called hogans, were laid out in a circular fashion with an entrance, and various things were done in various quarters of the house. And because of the way the Navajo lived, where their lands were placed in the landscape, there were distant mountains, roughly in the 4 cardinal directions, which they saw as significant. And they basically assigned a whole lot of properties to those different directions, and they were associated with color, with different gods, and so on. And for that reason, it was important to design your house in certain ways. And so even now, if you go into to a traditional hogan, or invited there by Navajo people, you walk sunwise, clockwise around inside the hogan. Certain things are done in the western side. Greeting visitors is done in the western side. Cooking was done in a certain side, and sleeping was done another side. And the entrance is always to the east. And yes, that has to do with the sun. It's always in the direction of sunrise, but it's also because of this whole cosmology. So it is cosmology, again, not in the modern sense, but in a way of understanding the world, tying everything together. And for the Navajo, it was about landscape, as well as what the sun does, the quarter where the sun rises, the quarter where the sun sets, the quarter where the sun is never seen, and the quarter where the sun passes over in the Northern Hemisphere. And for them, all these things were tied together, and you build your house, your traditional house, in harmony with that. And of course, if we're archaeologists coming along, and we knew nothing of this from the Navajo themselves and from their history, we would at least spot this tendency to always have the entrance, not exactly east, but in this sort of quarter of the horizon. So very often these orientations will be telling us something about these broader cosmologies. And of course, what people were doing in the past isn't always rational in our sense of looking at things. They didn't do things because, we can say, oh yes, it was more sensible to farm there or to plant the things at a certain time of year. A lot of it is that, of course, but also there will be other means of understanding going on in people's minds that will also influence that. And very often, and usually, the influences in a very positive way, sometimes that we find that we didn't understand until we get to know it better. And this is, as I'm actually I actually should say, I'm in an Iron Age village at the moment. And then this is because we're doing an excavation, which I'll mention at the end, about half an hour away from here, but there was no internet. So I was able to come here to an Iron Age village. And I'm in the shed at the back of the Iron Age village, and we're on plan C for connecting to the internet. So Boris, if you've been following the British news lately, had a plan B for COVID, which we're told we might be going on to. We needed plan C to get onto the internet this morning, but we made it. But anyway, if you look at Iron Age roundhouses, and here's a traditional one, not from where I am, in fact, they tend to have an orientation to the east and to the southeast. And there's been an argument for years as to whether that was cosmological because of, like the Navajo, people in the Iron Age had an idea of how the cosmos functioned, or whether it was practical. Because on the shortest days of the year, the sun's rising in the southeast, and so you get the early morning warmth heating up the house. And so you'd get this argument between the pragmatists and between the people who are saying, no, we have to understand things in a different way. They understood things a different way, it's cosmological. And of course, the two aren't exclusive. I strongly suspect there were elements of both going on. Anyway, so archaeoastronomy is all about that sort of stuff. Why is it important? Well, for me, the obvious answer, and the obvious answer with an audience like all of you, is, well, of course, the sky in the past was much more prominent than it is these days. So most people these days don't appreciate what a truly dark sky is like. But of course, people in the past did. They lived with every clear night. They would see a dark sky wherever they were in the world. That was part of their world, part of their environment. They lived with it. They understood it, and so on. And of course, that's the answer. But it wasn't the exclusive part. It was just one hugely important part of the world, a part that we in the modern world tend to have forgotten. But it's also a special part of their environment for us. And the reason for that is that if people build a monument like Stonehenge or something, they will relate it, just as the Navajo houses were related to, and indeed New Grange, to the broader environment. So you don't just stick a monument or even a house down, and it largely would have related to the whole environment around, which is the landscape, the visual landscape, other understandings of that, of course, and where ancestors came from, other things that were understood about that. But there may be topographic features there that are prominent that make sense to us. But the sky was all part of that. It's all mixed in. It wasn't exclusive, but it was just as much a part of all that as everything else. But it's special for us if we're trying to understand what people were doing in the past. And the reason for that is that, of course, we can construct exactly what their skies look like, because we have all our tools, and here's Stellarium, Planetarium tool. We can wind back the clock. We know where the sun and the moon rose and all the stars rose and set. We can do the precession. We can wind. So we know, actually, we can see their skies from the past, and we can't see other parts of their environment. Yes, we can get a broad idea of the topography, but we've no idea where they're, in any exact sense, what was going in the landscape. We get some clues from the archaeological things. Everything else is a bit fuzzy, or a lot fuzzy, but we know exactly what the sky is looking at. So if you've got monuments or houses that may have related to many different things, but if they related to the sky as part of that, we can see that, and we can measure that, and we can know that. So it gives us an important insight into all those past cosmologies and past understandings. And that's why, for me, archaeoastronomy is an important thing to do for understanding what was going on in the minds of people in the past. And the way we do it, the sort of evidence we deal with, well, alignments is the obvious one. So Stonehenge is pointing at Midsummer Sunrise, for example, or New Grange has its alignment. So alignments are one set of things that archaeoastronomers look at all the time, but also there are other things like counts of things. And now here's a lovely example from northern Mexico of a calendar from hunter-gatherer people, and it's actually a 9-month calendar, a lunar calendar. It marks off phases of the moon. And the reason that it runs for 9 months, it's to do with the gestation period for deer who they were hunting, and other things. This is a particularly fine example of a calendar that is marked on here. And of course, there are other ways of representing the sky. All of these have difficulties. I mean, for example, alignments. I mean, everything is got to be, every orientation has got to be aligned somewhere. And there's a lot of stuff in the sky. And you know, even if you took the 15 brightest stars, and if you're talking about prehistoric monument, you didn't know where in, say, 500 years, give or take, when it was built. Well, a 500-year period and the 15 brightest stars covers a third of the horizon. So you can kind of be prepared to choose the best date and choose the best star. You can fit almost anything to anything. So we have to be really careful about this. And counts is the same thing. And I remember astronomer Brad Schaefer, who some of you may know, he once, years ago, produced a list of possibly astronomical explanation for every number from 1 to 199. So it didn't matter what you were seeing. If you saw a number of dots, you would say, oh, there's an astronomical explanation for that. So again, we have to be really careful. But on the other hand, some things where you count off are very obvious. And also with representation. So the Nebra disk, famously, people claimed it to be some sort of surveying instrument. I think it is just a powerful representation of the cosmos, the sun and the moon for sure. Possibly this is meant to be the Pleiades, a cluster of stars. The rest of the stars are just distributed evenly around here. They're just symbolic representations. It was an object of power, dinner plate sized shield that probably some warrior was wearing, and this gave great cosmological power to that. And I suspect it was nothing more than that, but it's still a use of the sky that's important to us. So one way we know that our alignments are, or one way that we can be sure that an alignment measure meant something is that we have a whole lot of monuments that are pointing in a similar direction. This is a nice example from northeast Scotland, as I'm in Britain, of 70 stone circles, but they have a distinctive recumbent stone that was deliberately laid on its side on one side. They all they're all oriented within about 90 degrees of the compass. And this orientation, I won't go into the details, is basically related to the moon, as we think. And we can see that lunar association by looking at this trend in orientations. So a lot of it is about that sort of thing. But in practice, this is tricky because we can't get too statistical about all this, because we're not dealing with laws of the universe, we're dealing with people. So however strong the tradition was of, when we build a new stone circle, we orient it towards the sun or the moon or this event, depending what it was at the time, there were people are people. Traditions change, or Fred Bloggs of some family there will decide that his family are going to do it differently and they're going to orient it on something else. And so there's always going to be fuzzy edges because we're dealing with people. And of course, that introduces subjectivity. And this is always the balance that we have to strike between trying to be objective and choosing which, but at the same objective dealing with people, like it's this sort of scientific on one's logical. I've been showing the background here. Iron group, which I support. There was one famous group of two, fifth group to be discovered by the archaeologists in the 40s, and it's one temple with three temples on the to the east, and they're oriented on the solstice, the equinox, and the other solstice. And this was known, it's been known since the 40s, but there are now known to be about 50 of these groups of tombs at different sites. That's the word out, but they're just different mine site. None of the other, they're all roughly one on the west and a few on the east, but they don't work exactly. And so if you think of that too statistically, you say, oh, well, this one probably was chance, I think. Anthropologically, and in fact archaeologically too, what we think was going on was that initially, that these were actually related to the sun and to ceremonies with the sun. Initially, they were built incorporating actual alignments, but the later ones and later modifications of the ones that were there didn't need to keep reduplicating. People knew about the relationship with the sun and the ceremonies that went on there. They built them in the same style, but they didn't actually incorporate alignments in the same sense. And how you feel about that argument, whether you come down on the sun, that's a bit subjective, don't like that, or whether you think, okay, that makes anthropological sense, would depend on where you come from, whether you're more of an anthropologist or more of an astronomer or an archaeologist, depending. And that's the sort of issue we get into. So there you go. That was archaeology, and that's one side that I come into of this whole set of issues with dark skies from. And just to say, I said earlier, archaeoastronomy and ethoastronomy, cultural astronomy, there are actually other terms. One that's become popular recently is skyscape archaeology. And this tries to get across this idea that landscape and skyscape, in people's minds, we think of them two separate things. You know, this is all Linnaean classifications. If it's up in the sky beyond the clouds, it's astronomy, and so on. If it's walking around on the ground, it's biology, and so on. People in the past didn't use those boundaries. They made sense of what they perceived around them by connecting it all together in different ways. And the skyscape, alongside the landscape, was part of that. And so skyscape archaeology has become a popular term. And this is just to, if you've got a few $100 to spare, then there's this 3-volume handbook. But if you're at an institution that subscribes to Springer, you can get chapters on almost anything. It's like there's about 2,000 pages and about 250 articles on archaeoastronomy, ethnoastronomy from all over the place in that. So that's the archaeoastronomy. Now, on the other side of what I'm involved in is heritage. and World Heritage. Now, you may know about the World Heritage List from UNESCO. There's 1,150 odd properties on that at the moment. So the done thing is to call them World Heritage properties rather than World Heritage sites, because they can include landscapes and so on, but most of us still call them World Heritage sites informally. And they are, as you may well know, they're cultural. Most of them are cultural. So places like the Taj Mahal and so on are on the list. They're cultural sites. Places like Uluru are on the list because they're natural sites, and a small number are both mixed sites, as they're called. So there are World Heritage sites. They've been going for 30 years and more, and every year the World Heritage Committee of UNESCO decides to add a few more to the list. And occasionally, as we found out in Britain this year, sometimes they take them off too. Anyway, about 10, 15 years ago, it became an issue within UNESCO. Certain people in UNESCO became concerned because there weren't many sites to do with astronomy, or indeed science in general, on the World Heritage List. You know, if you look interested in Italian churches, there's like dozens of them. But if you're interested in like observatories or that, there's virtually nothing. In fact, there were a few, but they are generally there not because of their relationship to astronomy. So, you know, places like this is a 14th century Ulugh Observatory from Samarkand in Uzbekistan. That's on the list, but it's not on the list because it's an amazing site in the history of astronomy. It is there because it's part of Samarkand, which is at crossroads of cultures, and it's just one of the sites that's in there. Even the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, and the same is true of Pulkovo in Russia, even that is only on the list because it's part of maritime Greenwich, rather than being a fantastic observatory in its own sense. And likewise, on the ancient side of things, so Stonehenge, Giza pyramids, Newgrange, things are on the list, but they're not actually there because of their astronomical connection. They're there because of their archaeological importance. And so in 2004, UNESCO, or a couple of people within UNESCO, started up an initiative, Astronomy and World Heritage Initiative, and Anna Sidorenko, yeah, if I can say her name, Anna, goodness me, Anna Sidorenko was the person who got this going. And it was started, well, actually, it was about science being underrepresented on the list. You know, there's an S in UNESCO, and it stands for science, and people were realizing there ought to be a hell of a lot more science represented on the World Heritage List. And they focused on astronomy for one obvious reason, is that it's kind of there for all cultures. So actually, let's go for astronomy because it gives us more scope to find significant things. Well, that was fine by us. And I got involved as one of the experts in the early days, consulted on this. But the real breakthrough came in 2008. Now, 2009, some of you may remember, was the International Year of Astronomy. And in that, you know, UNESCO have these international years every year, and they can be all manner of things. I think 2010 was the International Year of the Potato, to put it in some sort of context. But anyway, so in 2009, UNESCO and the International Astronomical Union were very much involved in promoting the International Year of Astronomy. And so in the year preceding, they actually signed this big formal agreement, a memorandum of understanding, to promote this initiative together. So the IAU became involved. Now, I was involved in the IAU at the time because I was just about to become president of the History of Astronomy Commission within the IAU, because the IAU does contain a few people like me who are extremely lapsed astronomers and astrophysicists, but who've done nothing but history and archaeology and other things for most of their lives. But we're still involved in the IAU, and there is a history commission. And because I was president, so I was asked to lead this initiative on the side of the IAU. So I basically spent the next 10 years working with Anna from the IAU side to push forward the initiative. So, I mean, one of the things we did was to set up the portal to the heritage of astronomy, which you can still find out there on the internet, and it's still functioning, going strong. And one thing that does, it's basically a one-stop website for anyone who's interested in astronomical world heritage or potential world heritage. It has a load of case studies on it. Some of them are already World Heritage sites, some of them are not, some of them never will be. But the idea is to help people compare what's out there and whether, because the only people that can put forward World Heritage nominations at the end of the day are actual countries and their representative bodies. So, you know, we as astronomers couldn't go in and say this should be a World Heritage site, but people in certain countries could try and persuade their authorities to put forward World Heritage sites. And this sort of thing helps to give them more confidence by showing them how important it is. And we ended up working with the body called ICOMOS. It stands for the International Council on Monuments and Science, on Monuments and Sites. And this is an advisory body to UNESCO. And basically, when people put in nominations for cultural World Heritage sites, ICOMOS is the body that, that assesses them and tells UNESCO, recommends to UNESCO whether they should be listed or not. And so we actually in the IU worked with ICOMOS to produce a couple of things called Thematic Studies, which is very, as you can see, it had this very slipping off the tongue title, about heritage sites to do with astronomy and archaeoastronomy. And basically what this is about is trying to give countries that might want to put forward sites confidence to do so, and giving them case studies and examples and so on. The first one came out in 2010. And we had a hugely broad remit. It was great fun. Everything from prehistory through to classical sites or ancient parts of the world, right through to through the Renaissance stuff, to actually contemporary astronomy and astrophysics. And we were looking at modern observatories. Even space astronomy, we even got somewhat involved in thinking about, you know, potential heritage sites. You know, Neil Armstrong's footprints on the moon is an issue and how we preserve those. And of course, the thing that's particularly of interest to people here, dark sky places. And there were issues about getting dark sky places on the World Heritage List right from the start that we needed to try tackling more and on. Anyway, as a result of that initiative, these things take a long time to work through because countries have to decide that they want to put forward particular World Heritage sites. They have each country has what's called a tentative list with maybe a couple of dozen sites that they're going to put forward. The country's going to put forward one site in any given year. And then the whole process of having it assessed takes 18 months to 2 years. So it's a very slow process. And it happened that there were a couple of sites that were in the process when we started. One of these, observatory in India, Jantamantar, is one of the very latest fixed observatories in the Islamic tradition. And that was listed in 2010, as was the 14th century, I think it's 14th, gnomon, this huge horizontal gnomon for telling the time of year from the length of the noonday sun shadow in China. And these were listed in 2010 basically for their astronomical significance principally. And also a little bit after that, Stonehenge was actually, they amended the significance of why Stonehenge was on and actually for the first time to acknowledge that there were astronomical aspects to the significance of Stonehenge. Oh yeah, and that's just showing that it's not just Stonehenge, it's other sites in the vicinity have solstitial and potentially lunar alignments as well. And just in the last 2 or 3 years, this has really borne fruit. We had our first modern observatory listed a couple of years ago, which was Jodrell Bank in the UK. And also in the same year, a very different place, a thing called a cultural landscape, a whole landscape in the middle of Gran Canaria, the biggest of the Canary Islands. And this whole area is a landscape. It's got historical and modern cultural practices. many different things interrelated, but part of that, as I was talking earlier about, is the involvement of the sky and sites relating to the sky. And there are two very important archaeoastronomical sites as part of that. And so the Archaeoastronomy was a big part of that nomination. And perhaps the biggest thing and pleasing for me personally is that just now, and a couple of months ago, we had Chanquillo in Peru, the 13 towers were put on the list, which is lovely for me because I was one of the people that first published about this back in 2007. And here we are 14 years on, and it's become a World Heritage Site. So this is fabulous stuff. And that, if you're going to call somewhere something in the past an ancient observatory, perhaps this is it. I mean, it's certainly basically it's a calendrical instrument. You can measure the day of the year using sunrise against these towers from this observing point. We know this was an important point because there were people standing here. They were making ritual offerings. We found those archaeologically. It's basically a solar horizon calendar, but on a monumental scale. So each of these towers is like 4 to 6 meters tall and 10 meters on a side. These are huge. And there's much more to it than just the calendar. It's part of a huge ceremonial site. It's to do with regulating things, probably regulating warfare, because it was a very turbulent times. Anyway, but a fabulous place. I could go on about that for an hour, but I won't. But just coming back to dark skies, the dark skies were always a big issue of contention, and when the thematic initiative was put up on UNESCO's website, it always had this big statement in it that dark sky sites cannot be considered as World Heritage. And one of the problems is that, in a sense, having a dark sky is not a positive quality of a place. It's a sort of, as UNESCO looking at it, a sort of negative quality because it's a lack of light pollution. And so how you could sort of get round that mindset was one of the big challenges. And so the second thematic study, which came out 2017, was addressing 3 or 4 major issues with astronomy. And basically this goes into the dark sky qualities of place in huge detail. And to kind of very long story short, the background to this is that there are 10 criteria for what may make something worthy of being a World Heritage Site. And the key concept for UNESCO is this thing called outstanding universal value. What that actually means is that it's considered by UNESCO that the value of this place is so great that it transcends cultural boundaries. You know, without question, whoever you are in humanity, this is for you. And what's more, that's going to continue down the generations. So the OUV is just this concept that this is important for all humanity for all time, which is why it's so important to preserve. And then there are various criteria for recognizing that, of which the key one is number 1, it's unique. A unique masterpiece. And there are others and these 1 to 5 are all on the cultural side. Different ways in which it can be the pinnacle of a certain human tradition and it's the best preserved and so on. There's a funny criterion 6 is intangible. So this is more about what's in people's minds. And there have been huge issues with that because science, of course, is intangible in itself. So science related to science can have a strong criterion 6, but on the other hand, they need something tangible there, something that actually is physical that represents that. And then 7 to 10, I haven't put them all down here, are the natural ones. And I just put in 7, which is the superlative natural place. And so the question for us was, well, so do we think of dark skies as cultural or natural? Well, the conclusion that that we came up with, we had to acknowledge that, in a sense, a dark sky place can't in itself be considered a World Heritage Site, and we couldn't get away from that. But what we argued was that, and what's been accepted, is that dark sky values, the dark sky properties of a place can enhance. If you've got some other some other aspect of the site that's recognized as OUV, is recognized as that makes it World Heritage, be it cultural or natural, then the dark sky property can be a very strong contributing factor to that, and hence needs preserving and everything that goes with it. And so the dark sky values can enhance both the natural or the cultural value, which means that as part of putting that site forward for World Heritage, you become concerned about preserving that, and your case for nominating that site then has to include all the mechanisms for preserving the dark skies as part of that recognised value of the place. Now, that's the way we went forward. Now, in practice, there's different ways of handling different sites. So we have various sites on the list that are dark skies, but can be handled in different ways. And this is one from Hungary, and the Hortobágy Puszta, if I pronounce it approximately right, is a sort of not quite marshland. It's a low grassland area, rather unique in Central Europe. Western, you don't find them in Western Europe. There's some further east, but it's an extraordinary area physically, and that has brought with it extraordinary shepherding, particularly practices, but animal herding practices. And this became a World Heritage Site because of the shepherding practices and the cultural side of the place. But also it became one of the earliest IDA sky parks because the shepherding practices are linked to the dark skies, and we know about this, and the shepherds use the stars to regulate the shepherding practices. So this has the World Heritage status, and it has the dark sky park status together, which is one way to handle it. And it's a part of the physical heritage, the cultural heritage, which is still there to this day, which is intangible. And people think of heritage as the World Heritage List, places, spectacular monuments, but there's also through Criterion 6 I mentioned, but also there are other initiatives within the UNESCO that recognise intangible heritage, and this keys into all of them. Another approach is the approach that's been taken down in New Zealand, where there's been a big interest for some years in trying to get the Aoraki Mackenzie. This is where it was the first gold international dark sky reserve, I'm sure you all know. And there's been various people interested in trying to get that recognised as a World Heritage Site as well. And the most promising way forward with this one would seem to be to try and get it as an extension to the existing Southwest New Zealand, which is a huge area which is already a World Heritage Site. This is a natural World Heritage Site. It actually ticks, one of the few natural World Heritage Sites that ticks all 4 of the criteria for natural sites. It's a huge area, and it's beautiful and it's important. But there's an overlap with Aoraki Mount Cook in the corner with the Aoraki Dark Sky Reserve area. And so what people are trying, and this is ongoing, is to see if they can have this attached with the dark sky properties onto the existing World Heritage Site to extend it. And of course, that brings with it, I'm getting close to that question, gradually closer. This brings with it tourism, because when you nominate a site for World Heritage status, or when you're thinking about more generally about heritage of the site, that brings tourism, and a World Heritage Site brings tourism, and of course part of that is how you're going to handle that tourism. And if dark skies are important, then you're going to want dark sky tourism, and not other forms of tourism going to ruin the dark skies. At Aoraki Mackenzie, around the Mount John Observatory, they handle this very well. This is their cafe, their dark sky cafe. If you go there at night, they have the infrared lights in there, and people can go in while they're looking at the dark skies or looking at other stuff at Mount John, but they can go in there and relax in the cafe, and there's no light pollution. It's all very carefully handled. Another example from one of those thematic studies from Austria. Again, now we're back in Europe, the much more lighting, but these are relatively dark areas in Austria. And again, with the dark sky tourism built into the picture to try and preserve that aspect of the heritage. And of course, it's also an issue at major observatory sites. And we've been going around this quite a bit in the context of the initiative. Obviously, Jodrell Bank's on the list now, but there have been various thoughts about putting some of the major optical observatories, particularly the ones in northern Chile, or perhaps the ones on the Canaries, maybe even Mauna Kea on Hawaii, but that's a whole bunch of other issues there, as you may be aware. But again, I mean, there are various issues with observatory directors, and the main worry amongst modern observatory directors is, hang on a minute, if you're going to put forward my observatory as World Heritage, surely that's going to restrict the science. I've got to have, this observatory has to have the flexibility to carry on doing science. That means constant change, building new telescopes, etc., of course. Well, heritage isn't like that. I mean, and one of the reasons that we've got Jodrell Bank on there is because you have a plan for how you're going to develop, but basically preserve certain aspects that link to the heritage that you've got, so that you still retain your outstanding universal value. And there doesn't have to be a conflict. It's a question of thinking through how you express the values of the heritage and how you preserve those while continuing to have all the flexibility you need to continue doing science. But of course, there are some examples, and Pic du Midi in France is the classic one of this, where they've actually used tourism to really keep the science going. And Pic du Midi has, my goodness, it's had some ups and downs over the decades of its existence. But a major one 20 or was it 30 years ago now, when all the funding seemed to be stopping and there was no way to preserve it. And they came up with the scheme to actually encourage tourism at the site, to bring tourists up on enhanced cable cars and things. But also to make those tourists aware of the science, and in a sense to use the income from that tourism to keep quite a lot of the science going at Pic du Midi. And that model has actually worked for them, and it's the reason that Pic du Midi is still there now and still doing science. So that can work. But the big issue is tangible connections. And if we're coming back, whether it's UNESCO or elsewhere, if you're going to say, right, we need a dark sky around this cultural site, then people are going to say, well, okay, but what's the connection you're preserving? Now, there are places with, and of course, the thing is that most, well, okay, I'll come back to that. Here's an example from Oman in the Middle East that was in one of the case studies. And this is a lovely example because it's a culture. It is actually a World Heritage Site, but the World Heritage is to do with the scheme for assigning water. And they have these systems, they call them aflaj. Aflaj is the plural, and falaj is the singular, so I'm told. And if there's Arabic speakers, forgive me for getting this slightly wrong. But the point is that they had these traditional systems for managing water supplies, so that for a certain length of time, for an hour or however long it is, a certain farm will get the water and then it will be switched. And the local representative who is making those switches times it. And traditionally, that timing was done by sighting stars at night. Was during the day, it's done by sighting the sun with sundial ways of doing it with sundials. But during the night, it was done with stars. And you can still find these little markers. They're done in different ways. Certainly 50 years ago, and a bit more recently than that, these were quite extensive. And the person would sight on Sirius or another bright star, and sight against various markers. When the star aligned with those markers, then it would be time to switch the water to the next farm or something. And so here, there was a system, a cultural system. It was threatened by two things. threatened by wristwatches in about 40 years ago, but also was threatened by light pollution because people would start not being able to see the skies again. And so both of those became important in trying to preserve the heritage of this practice, the traditional practice. And so that has been done, I think, to a small extent, though a lot of it has been lost. But yes, what I was going to say earlier was that most of the ancient monuments, coming back to Britain for the moment, have to do with the sun or possibly the moon. And the thing about that is it's not about, well, sunrise and sunset, it's not really about dark skies. So most of these sites where we have agreed connections with between ancient sites and the sky, it's more to do with solstices or occasionally with the moon, or quite often more controversially, very rarely with stars. That's not to say that people weren't making those connections in the past. The problem is that there's a lot of possibilities. And so we can't just select one. You know, if we haven't got a person from 5,000 years ago saying, oh, yes, we did this, we can't just come along and say, well, that star aligns, because there's too many to choose from. We can't prove it. If you like, it's just not leaving its record in the archaeological record that's available to us, whereas a solstitial alignment is something more obvious, and we can see it more easily. There are a few possibilities, and I think the most viable one, and it's still a bit controversial, is a place called Thornborough. This is in Yorkshire, in northern England. I've put a map on here. And it's 3 henge monuments. So a henge monument is like Stonehenge without the stones, if you like, a huge ditch and bank monument, probably 300 meters across, that sort of size. And there are 3 of these in a rough alignment with entrances at two ends. And they broadly align with the rising, pretty precisely with the rising of Sirius, and before that of Orion's belt, or coming up at this angle at our latitude. Now that in itself doesn't prove a lot, but here there's a lot of archaeological evidence. First of all, that these were pilgrimage sites, and around a couple of these henges are huge areas that have been excavated full of tools and instruments and other things that people have come. There were crowds camping out around these sites, people coming here for ceremonies, and there are lots of evidence of quite fine tools being brought and then not thrown away unused, but presumably they were being given as votive offerings at these ceremonies. People coming from quite some way around, like 100 miles or so or more, from across the Pennines, the hills up the middle of England. They were coming from some distance. How did they know when to come? How did they know when a ceremony was going to take place? And so what's been proposed, and I think quite viably, is that they used the heliacal rising, first appearance before pre-dawn arrival of Orion's belt and then Sirius, to time, well, basically when Orion's belt starts appearing, that's the time to set out. And it might take you a couple of weeks to get to the place. And then when you get there, and this is symbolized in Sirius and Orion's belt, these are orientations. The site spans, there's earlier monuments here, 1,000 years earlier. They're off alignment slightly, which seems to be correcting for precession, which also adds a bit of plausibility to this. So there are arguments for saying that here's a site that probably did relate to the stars, but that sort of thing's rare, at least where we only have prehistory to go. Here's another example. I'm whipping you around the world here. And so this is, how am I doing on time? Have I really been talking for an hour? I'll shut up in a moment. Wow, doesn't time fly when you're sitting in a shed enjoying yourself? Yeah, so here's an example from Hawaii, and it's a wall. And yes, here's the Southern Cross, of course. This is a very strange wall. It's basically on the southernmost point of the island of Maui. This is a very backlands area. It's a very marginal area. Unfortunately, there's no golf courses and resorts here. No one comes to here. And down by the beach is this wall. It's an isolated stretch of really substantial wall with this huge, great notch in the middle of it. It was never connected to anything. What the heck was it there for? And to cut a long story short, its alignment, looking the other way out to sea, as you saw in the previous picture, is upon the Southern Cross. It's slightly off south, so it captures the Southern Cross when it's standing upright. The name traditionally is the Pa Nana, and in Hawaiian, Pa is to look, Nana is to look, and a Pa is a wall. So it means sighting wall, that's its name. And interesting, Pa Nana in modern Hawaiian is the word for a compass. And what we believe it wasn't something for observing the Southern Cross going across. We think it was a monument site. It's basically built archaeologically around the time when the long distance navigation was fading out across the Pacific, so probably 1300 AD. We think it was a monument. This was the place where the currents bring you in if you're coming up to the Hawaiian Islands from Tahiti, and also the place where you leave from. This is monumentalizing, if you like, through the stars, because for Hawaiians, the Southern Cross symbolizes the voyage south. It's symbolizing voyages, maybe even a particular voyager. We don't know that. So there is a direct connection to the skies, and in fact here's another one. This is one on the Pleiades. The Pleiades regulated the Hawaiian calendar. We have 2 or 3 sites, lots of temples aligned on the Pleiades, particular type of temple, but 3 or 4 of them with very precise sighting devices. So, and here is a modern site, Holomoana, the House of the Ocean, and it's a site that's still sacred, and so I showed this with permission, and it is related to voyaging, and in fact because it's related to voyaging by the stars and its connections to the stars, a lot of this is now modern preserved knowledge, but there was a strong push about 15 years ago by developers to build a new housing estate up the coast from here, and because of this association with the site, that was stopped because it was important to preserve the dark skies and that connection at that site. So finishing, I'm about to finish, back at Stonehenge, we have, of course, Stonehenge is not in the darkest place in the world, and people, when they're given permission, can come here at night. We have a big problem with Stonehenge at night, mainly the A303, which is a huge trunk road that goes just past the site. Yes, there's a whole load of controversy going on about shoving it in a tunnel. Unless anyone's interested, I won't go into that right now, and which would preserve some of the light pollution. But I came back from one of my trips from Hawaii about a few years ago, and was sitting in the bath. I don't want to get too go into too much detail on this, but I am sitting in the bath on a Saturday morning reading the paper, and there was this letter in the Times saying Stonehenge should be lit up at night. And it got me a bit annoyed, so annoyed that I ended up writing a response to this and sending it off to the Times, which got published itself the next Monday. And then I had the Radio 4 ringing up. We wanted to and so basically I ended up becoming the bête noire in this argument about whether Stonehenge should be lit up at night. The point, I obviously don't think it should. I really don't think it should. But of course, at the end of the day, all the alignments at Stonehenge are to do with the sun and the moon. They're not, there's nothing, despite what people may say, that specifically aligns to the stars. No evidence for it at Stonehenge. I'm sure people are there looking at the stars. For me, the reason it's important to preserve places like Stonehenge with as dark a sky as possible, and to make sure that the tourism does not conflict with that, is because we are trying to give people an impression of not just the monument itself, but where it stood in its landscape, in the whole environment that people appreciated at the time. Yes, I know the landscape's changed, but just as we're trying to get this road removed so that this road you see here already has been removed, that's part of restoring Stonehenge to its natural or more natural environment, so that people can appreciate that best. And for me, keeping the skies as dark as possible at Stonehenge is actually an integral part of that, because the sky was the natural environment, and reminding people of that by having this site dark at sky is dark at night is absolutely integral to that. And so I will continue to argue in that way in the future. Look, I'm sorry I've gone on much longer than I was intending. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening. I'm in Wales, so there it is in Welsh as well. And if you've got time, if anyone's still there around and wants to ask a few things, I'm happy to sit here. They've supplied me with a coffee, which is wonderful. I'm going to stop sharing so you see me back in my hut. And thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Clive. That's a real world tour of astronomical heritage sites. It's amazing. And you know, as a so-called professional astronomer myself, I've not heard of some of these sites, so I've definitely learned something, as well as becoming more aware of my own ignorance. So thank you for that. So we'd like to give everybody listening the chance to ask some questions, if you would like. So I'm just looking at the chat. So we've lots of very nice comments in the chat, Clive. That's a much appreciated.
I just brought it up. Thank you, everyone. No, it's a pleasure.
Yeah. So go ahead, Fred.
Oh, thanks, Richard. Look, I feel embarrassed talking about this because it's slightly off the theme of your talk, Clive. It's a fantastic talk. Thank you very, very much. But I've got some burning questions about Chunquillo.
Oh yeah, go for it.
And it's not really linked to the theme of dark skies and monuments, but you probably know that Marnie and I actually visited Chunquillo in 2007 with Ivan Gatesi. And I wrote about our visit subsequently and thought a lot about what that monument is all about. And I was left with questions that didn't seem to have any answers. And I wonder if you've got any now. This is 14
Probably
years
not,
ago.
but go for it.
Well, one of the things that's really intriguing is, as you said, it's a notched horizon. Basically, these 13 towers notch the horizon, as seen from two observation sites, one on the eastern side and one on the western side. And it's intriguing that one of them, and it's a long time since I read this stuff, Clive, so forgive me stumbling through it. I can't remember which way around it is, but they differ in what you see. One has a full view of the 13 towers, and the other, is it 11? You can only see 11 from the other side.
11. Well, you would have been able to see 12 because the 12 towers been degraded a bit.
Yes,
but yeah, the 13th one bends round, so you don't see anything more than perhaps the very tip of that from the eastern side. Yes.
So is that simply the fact that the towers were aligned along the ridge itself, this north-south ridge, which has a curve in one end of it? I think, if I remember right, is it the northern end? I can't remember. But
it's the southern end.
It's the southern end. Okay. So there wasn't any logic in placing the sites where you could see 11 on one side and 13 on the other. It is just accidental. Is that your view?
Well, I still am not entirely convinced about the eastern observing point and what it was doing. I mean, it's the western observing point that is clearly the important one from the archaeological evidence. You had this building that had a corridor going round the outside of it, yes, with high walls on both sides. And it opens out. So people, now corridors going into buildings as mazes is very common around there, and it's in the other buildings. But in this one, you go round, and when you come round to the final side of the corridor, there's just an opening in front of you. There would have been doors and all other openings. You can see where the door jambs would have fitted in. This one was just an opening, so it's unique in that sense. And then you have this scattering of all the votive offerings, as they clearly are. So that's clearly a special place for just one person observing point, looking at the sunrise. And from there, you see the towers perfectly on the horizon. Now, in fact, the towers 1 to 11 are ever so slightly going away from you, and then it bends around towards you. So, and the gap between 12 and 13 is on a longer sight line across the site. So the geometry works from there, and of course the solstice observations and all the observations in between work from there. All we have for the eastern observing point, we know that there was nothing around because in the plaza, except there was this apparently a small building at the spot where you would need to be in order to see the towers spanning it from the eastern side. And it's virtually completely destroyed. So it's more of a speculation that something that was a point. And you can argue, well, because people always ask, you know, well, surely if you've got 12 things in a line, there's going to be some point where you can see the sun rising. Yeah. Well, archaeologically, there's no doubt about the western observing point, because but the eastern one, yes, archaeologically, it is the only structure on that side within, you know, tens of yards tens of meters in any direction. But beyond that, there's no evidence. And yes, it's strange that the towers go around, so you probably would only have seen the very tip of the 13th tower. But there's no doubt from the other side. What's more, the end towers are taller. Yeah. So the 13th tower is actually really pretty unstable because it's so tall. In order to fit it in, it has to be about 7 meters tall on the downslope side, on the south side. And it's pretty amazing it's still there, to be honest. But yeah.
Thank you very much. That's
anyway, yes.
Thanks for the question, Fred. So we had a couple of comments and questions come up around one of our favorite heritage sites here in Australia, Uluru. And it pertains to, you know, how appropriate or not it is to you know, put lighting on Uluru itself or in the vicinity of Uluru for tourism purposes. And so I guess I wonder if you have any thoughts about that particular installation.
Well, I mean, I think it has to be the indigenous people who answer that question primarily. But my own feeling would be that the state of the natural site in the past would have not had any artificial lighting, so that it's wrong to put any sort of artificial lighting there now. And certainly, you know, if you start doing anything that is trying to enhance, you know, sound and light shows or anything like that, it would be appalling. So, you know, with some dark sky sites like at Araki Mackenzie, you have to make it safe. So you might have a few little you know, red lights on the approach to there, so that people can get there. But at a place like Uluru, it's just a natural place, and then the natural sky should say it all there. So I would be deeply uncomfortable seeing any sort of lighting there, and I imagine that anyone with any cultural association that would be ever so more deeply uncomfortable with that.
Yeah, thanks for that perspective. We've had a question here. There's been a lot about sunrises. What about the sunsets?
Well, there are a number of orientations that we're keen on, and I think are fairly demonstrable to with sunset. And I mean, Stonehenge is one of them, because people talk about midsummer sunrise at Stonehenge, and that's what most of the Druids go there for in June. But if you think about, there's an avenue that approaches Stonehenge from the northeast. It comes up from the River Ava, and it's about 3 kilometers long, and it bends round, and then the last stretch is straight up to Stonehenge. So the formal approach to Stonehenge, the ceremonial formal approach, is from the northeast. Now, if you think about any sacred site that you can think of, a church or anything else, you go into the place, the stuff that's important, the altar, whatever, is ahead of you. You don't go into a church and then turn around and the altar's back behind you again, which implies to me that, you know, if the formal approach to Stonehenge is from the northeast, then what's the important thing, the important sacred direction is ahead of you, which would mean it's to do with midwinter sunset rather than midsummer sunrise behind. You know, I've argued that for years. And I remember there was one of our I think time team programs or something. They were talking about this, and then but Clive thinks they're all looking the wrong way, you know, this sort of thing. But I do think that at Stonehenge and also at Durrington Walls, which is a site just 2 or 3 kilometers away, there's another, but in the shorter ceremonial approach, which works with the setting sun at midsummer. And one of the viable theories is that there were actually processions between the two at the 2 solstices, and this was part of the ceremonial calendar and what was done through the year. And of course, Stonehenge wasn't exact in time, it was exact in space. It was pretty good in space, but it didn't matter that it would be cloudy 3 nights out of 4, because you know, people didn't have an exact calendar. They didn't, you know, the first time that you see the sun rising or setting in the right alignment is when you did the procession.
Yeah, very interesting. So one question from Gabriella is asking if there are examples of laws that protect culturally significant outdoor sites from being lit at night anywhere in existence in the world right now. Are there examples for us to draw from?
Well, there are certainly lighting laws in countries. So, for example, Chile or the Canaries. So Chile has quite a strong lighting laws around the observatories there, and some of them are more challenged than others. But there are certainly different examples of lighting laws. The ones on the Canaries are pretty strong as well. So yeah, there's stuff out there. I think some of them are referred to in a number of the case studies on the heritage portal for the sites concerned. But certainly there are measures, legal measures out there, and indeed there need to be, because, you know, people are going for, say, World Heritage status. I mean, the misconception about it is that, you know, if we get World Heritage status, the site is protected. No, it's not like that. What you have to do is to actually prove to UNESCO that you have the national infrastructure to preserve it, and then then UNESCO will recognise it, and then you use the recognition as you will. But it's up to you, the country, to have the laws in place and the mechanisms in place to do the preservation.
Very interesting. So the grassroots comes first, and then you take it to UNESCO. Yeah. So that does address another interesting question from Hilary. Thanks for the interesting talk. What are the next steps with the World Heritage Acknowledgement of dark sky areas, and who's likely to do what?
Well, the moment, I mean, it comes down to particular governments and what they decide to do. So I'm still full of hope with the New Zealand government on this, and we have a superb advocate in the form of Margaret Austin, who is a former New Zealand politician who's been pushing for this for ages, and still, I mean, she's in her 80s, but a marvelous lady, and she is still pushing for ways to try and get that one recognised. So I'm still, but again, how far she's got with I think it's the DOC down there with that nationally, I haven't heard in the last 12 months or so. I have hopes of that one. Where we went with we had this initiative called Windows to the Universe, which was trying to tie together some of the most important modern observatory sites. And initially it was northern Chile, a number of observatories there, Mauna Kea in Hawaii, and the Canarian observatories. But every time you get more than one government to try and work together, that multiplies up all the probabilities and the complications. And the last we had on that one was that the Canarians basically had decided that actually everything was working fine for them, and they didn't need to have World Heritage status in addition, because what they've seemed to have managed on La Palma is that culturally the population's with them, basically, and that people respect it, and there aren't too many pressures for the dark skies that are pushing light pollution. People respect the observatory, so they the last I was aware of, they were relatively happy there. Whereas the Chileans had been hoping that World Heritage status would help them protect the observatories. And of course, it's got to be the other way around, and they've certainly got issues with mining interests and other things at some of the sites, and I think those battles at the moment are being fought nationally. And I'm, to the latest of my knowledge, was they may be going in other directions with the World Heritage related to that, not necessarily to help with the light pollution issues.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we have a question or comment from Fred.
Once again, I don't want.
Oh, same Fred. Hello.
I don't want to take up too much time, but yeah, you're right about observatories. We under the order in which things come, we got the Siding Spring Observatory protected by state legislation before we put in the application for the Warrumbungle Dark Sky Park, which is right next door. And these things are all, observatories around the world are reasonably well protected, but we have a new threat on the horizon, which you know what I'm going to say, I'm sure.
I do indeed.
And I wondered what your view was and what your thinking is on the satellite constellations.
I remember about 10 years ago being utterly horrified when I heard some story, which I didn't believe scientifically at the time, but it just, where they were talking about selling, developing a technology that could beam a laser and basically a small number of pixels effectively onto the moon. And so, so that people could buy time, so you could suddenly maybe have the full moon lit up with a big M or something. And I'm, even though I didn't believe it was technically possible then or now, that thought horrified me. I'm afraid the thought of the constellation of satellites horrifies me just as much as that, if not far more. Suddenly, light pollution is related to place, and at least there are lots of places on this planet where, even if you have light pollution in some of them, you don't in others. But my goodness, the constellation of satellites is universal. It just wraps up the whole planet. I find the whole idea absolutely horrific, basically.
Okay, second from last question. Yeah, you have sympathetic ears here. Yeah, second from last question. So from Judith this time. Has Clive knowledge of the Wurdi-Young stone arrangement in Western Victoria, Australia, which it is suggested indicate the setting sun at solstice and equinox?
Yeah, I do have knowledge of that, and I did visit the place some years ago now. And in fact, there is a case study of that in the first thematic study of the two UNESCO thematic studies, but it has become a very sensitive issue. As I understand it, the ownership of the site has changed, and the current owners are extremely sensitive about the site being acknowledged, the site being called Wurdi-Young, and anything being said about it. So we have actually, in respect of that, taken the site off the portal. It was on there before. We have communicated with the current owners to say, look, we do respect this, and we would like your input on that. We would like to be able to say something. But at the moment, the current owners are telling us all not to say anything about it. So, but what we can't do, of course, is unpublish what's already out there. So the first thematic study did mention the site, and other publications have in the past.
Yeah, thanks for that. And the last question that I think has been burning a hole in everyone: why are you in a shed in Wales right now?
Yeah, I never said, did I? Okay, yeah. Right. So in the last few years, well, we've known for 40 years or more that the bluestones at Stonehenge, which are the small, relatively small ones, the ones that are the sort of a couple of meters tall and weigh 6 tons, as opposed to the huge sarsens that weigh 10 times as much. But the bluestones come from the Preseli Mountains in southwest Wales. So it's about 300 kilometers to get there. And that's been known for decades. Geologically, that's where the stones came from. It was speculated back in the 70s and 80s, because no one could conceive that people would have transported these, dozens of these six-ton stones. And it was thought that maybe they had been brought there on glaciers, and that was a push by, they were glacial erratics. Geologically, that's a nonsense, because the glaciers that would have pushed things southwards, they wouldn't have pushed things eastwards, is one major argument. Basically, people, there's no doubt, and there hasn't been for a while, that the bluestones came from southwest Wales, from the Preseli, a small mountain range here. Well, they're hills, really. In recent years, the geology has got better, and they can now locate to within particular quarries where different types of the bluestones came from. And so what's been happening for the last few years, Mike Parker Pearson, who's one of the main archaeological experts on Stonehenge, has been excavating around here, trying to see whether there were precursors, like there were stone circles and other structures here, dating from before when Stonehenge was built. Because if people go back 10, 15 years, people would say that, well, probably the people in Wessex were really powerful, and their influence extended to hundreds of kilometers, so they would get stones brought to them from South Wales if that's what they thought were important because of their healing properties, whatever they might be. But we've now been discovering that there are stone circles here. And some of them were known, but most of them were fallen or hidden under the peat or whatever. And that they seem to be some sort of precursors to Stonehenge. And there may even be 1 or 2 stones that were physically transported. And one of Mike's ideas, one of the stones they're excavating at the moment, was a bluestone circle, and many of those bluestones were then physically transported. And possibly that there was actually a wave of people moved from this area, southwest Wales, across to Stonehenge. So we're looking at those, and of course one of the questions of interest is, well, if they were interested in the solstices at Stonehenge, was there something in these earlier circles? These are dating back to the sort of 3,500, 3,000 BC. Are they doing the same thing here? So I'm involved in that, and we're looking at the alignments of these earlier sites, and that's why I'm over here.
Oh, thanks.
And it's fun.
Yeah. Well, we should let you get to the site. I guess they'll be waiting for you, and I hope it's a fruitful trip.
Yeah.
So thank you again so much, Clive. We really appreciate you taking the time and sitting in the shed for an hour and a half to talk to us.
I'd forgotten I was in the shed. I got a little carried away.
And so thank you so much. I hope this is a topic that we'll revisit. It's obviously had a lot of interest in the audience, and it's certainly close to the interests of ADSA. And I'll just remind you to, if you haven't already, please check out our website, and the video of this talk will be posted there at some point in the not too distant future, and you can peruse that at your leisure. We are able to put these things up thanks to kind donations and sponsorship and engagement from you, the public. So if you're interested in this topic, please check out the website, and we always appreciate donations. And I'll leave it there for tonight. We'll hopefully see you at the next webinar, which will be announced through the usual channels. And so thank you, everyone, and I wish you a pleasant evening or day wherever you are. Thanks.